Hello and welcome back to Era 7 of the APUS History Curriculum. In this video, we will be looking at Topic 7.5, World War I, the Military and Diplomacy. While the outbreak and early part of the war is not strictly U.S. history, we will look at a brief overview of how it started in the first place, in order to understand the causes and the consequences of the U.S. eventually joining in on the side of the Allies. So let's get to it. 1. More commonly known as the Great War, was sparked by multiple causes, including an immediate cause that served as the final spark, igniting European escalation. Militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and an assassination. Militarism is the glorification of military power and the buildup of a country's arms and firepower to outpace their neighboring nations. This began with the buildup of armies starting in the 19th century, and then spread to the buildup of navies. Once Germany started this process, Britain countered with their own, even larger buildup, creating a back-and-forth increase in military spending and weapons. With so many smaller nations in close proximity to one another, European powers have long been in conflict with each other. To avoid constant worries about invasions from all sides and tip the balance of power to their favor, nations established alliances with their neighbors. These not only offered guaranteed safety and protection from member states, but also stimulated trade between them. By World War I, Europe was defined by two major alliances: the Triple Alliance, made up of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy, who was later replaced by the Ottoman Empire, and the Triple Entente, made up of Britain, France, and Russia. Nationalism is an ideology that emphasizes the importance of a shared national identity. It often involves a strong attachment and loyalty to one's nation, as well as a belief in the nation's right to self-determination and sovereignty, often to the detriment of the interests of other nations. Imperialism is the extending of a country's influence beyond its own borders. This was essentially the root of the entire age of exploration and colonization. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, there had been a scramble for control of colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Some European nations acquired more overseas territories than others, and so tensions between these countries began to rise. These tensions led to increased competitions between the major European powers and a desire for still more territorial expansion and economic gain. And finally, there is the assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne, and his wife while in Sarajevo in Bosnia, which was a target of Austrian imperialism in the Balkan region of Europe. The assassin, a man named Gavrilo Princip, was a member of the ultra-nationalist terrorist group called Black Hand, whose ultimate goal was to create an independent Serbian state. Austria-Hungary demanded Princip and his co-conspirators be turned over to them, with Germany backing the demand. Russia, a Serbian ally, mobilized its military forces in response, triggering Germany to mobilize theirs. Britain joined in after Germany invaded Belgium, which was then a British possession, in order to get to France, who was allied with Russia, and therefore mobilizing its own forces. The war itself was a devastating conflict that stretched across the globe, with fighting on the Western Front, which is the French-German-Belgian border, as well as fighting in Eastern and Southeast Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Many of these battles were particularly devastating, with millions of men engaged and tens of thousands of casualties. The Battle of the Marne, fought in September of 1914, represented the end of mobile warfare on the Western Front, and the war there devolved into trench warfare, which, combined with the introduction of modern weaponry, caused huge casualties. In a single day at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, 100,000 British troops plodded across a no-man's land into steady machine gun fire from German trenches a few yards away. Some 60,000 were killed or wounded. At the end of the full battle, which lasted from July to November, 419,654 British men were killed, missing, or wounded, and their entire advance was just 7 miles. The Battle of Verdun, fought from February to December of 1916, was the longest and one of the bloodiest of the war. The Germans losing over 430,000 men, killed or wounded, and the French approximately 550,000 men. And these were just the losses on the Western Front. Initially, President Wilson declared the U.S. neutral and demanded that the warring nations respect American rights as a neutral party, in keeping with U.S. foreign policy tradition of non-involvement in European affairs. Since the days of George Washington, the U.S. had pursued a policy of isolationism and neutrality. As a country, though, the U.S. was quite divided. We may have had cultural and political ties to Britain, but the large population of Irish-American immigrants did not want to support the British in any way. In addition, the large German-American population didn't want to go to war against Germany. Plus, we wanted to trade with both sides. Wilson also warned Americans that involvement in the conflict would certainly disrupt progressive reforms. In 1916, President Wilson narrowly won re-election after campaigning on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But the situation had really begun to change, and ultimately the U.S. got pulled into the war for a variety of reasons. First, in late January 1917, Germany announced that it would resume its practice of unrestricted submarine warfare. And since the Germans considered any ship entering the war zone to be fair game, the ships of neutral nations and even passenger liners were at risk. It was this practice that had resulted in the sinking of the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland in 1915, killing 128 Americans among the nearly 1,200 total dead. Since Germany hadn't wanted the U.S. to enter the war at that time, they had pledged to stop the practice. But now they felt they were on the verge of winning, and the practice would be more devastating to Britain than the U.S. entering the war would be towards Germany. Another reason for the U.S. decision to finally enter the war was Germany's Zimmermann telegram, sent in early 1917. It was a proposal to Mexico to ally with Germany against the U.S., and in exchange, Germany would help Mexico regain territory in the American Southwest. The hope was that Mexico would keep the U.S. from providing effective assistance to the Allies, since the U.S. would have to protect its interests at home. The revelation of the message to the American public was met with outrage and demands for war. Also by then, the U.S. was so economically tied to the Allies that they needed to join in, or the U.S. economy would be ruined. American banks and businesses had provided loans and traded extensively with the Allies. For example, the Allies had loans from American banks totaling $2.5 billion, while the Germans only owed U.S. banks about $56 million. Still another reason the U.S. eventually joined the Great War is because of the revolution in Russia that began in early 1917, eventually resulting in the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the rise of Vladimir Lenin to power. Russia was unable to continue its fighting on the eastern front of the war, allowing Germany to relocate significant forces over to the western front, threatening to overwhelm Britain and France. Now, Wilson's attitude about the Great War had initially been to support the idea of peace without victory, and he hoped to establish a League of Nations to prevent future conflict. But with all of those combined factors, he now supported the idea that the world had to be made safe for democracy, which was a significant departure from traditional U.S. foreign policy. So in April 1917, Congress voted to declare war on Germany. Of course, the U.S. wouldn't be able to provide reinforcements right away, because we still had to recruit and train a military. Not long after declaring war, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. It eventually required all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for military service. Under the act, approximately 24 million men registered for the draft. Of the total U.S. troops sent to Europe, about 2.8 million had been drafted, and about 2 million had volunteered. In addition, the U.S. Navy would be used to hunt down German U-boats and to protect supply and troop ships using armed convoys. The first trickle of American troops arrived in Europe in late 1917, but the bulk would not begin arriving until the summer of 1918. By then, Russian troops had completely withdrawn from the war, allowing Germany to throw everything they had to the action on the Western Front, getting to within 50 miles of Paris. The U.S. military participated in several major offensives once its troops arrived in significant numbers. The Army and Marine troops played a key role in stopping a German move towards Paris during the Second Battle of the Marne in June of 1918. The first major offensive led by American troops was the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, with General John Pershing commanding nearly 500,000 men to attack German positions. This was followed by the Meuse-Argonne offensive, lasting from September 26 to November 11, 1918. It was the largest and most significant American operation, involving a massive push against German forces on the Western Front. This ultimately was the final major campaign of the war, during which Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany abdicated and an armistice was reached, going into effect at 11 a.m. Paris time on November 11th. The presence of the United States had tipped the balance of the conflict in favor of the Allies. It is also important to note that the United States military was still a segregated institution, with Black American soldiers serving separately from white soldiers, often focusing on menial labor tasks like unloading ships and transporting goods, rather than fighting. But this was primarily the experience for those serving under American command. Several infantry regiments fought under French command, where there wasn't as much of a tradition of discrimination and segregation, which was a significant change for those who experienced it. Before most U.S. troops had even arrived in Europe, President Wilson, in January of 1918, had published his ideas for what the post-war world might look like, called the 14 Points. Essentially, this was a plan to bring progressive ideals to the world stage. Wilson hoped to create a more just and stable world, seeking ideas of open diplomacy, meaning no more secret agreements, freedom of the seas, no more blockades or submarine attacks, free trade, national self-determination, as well as the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. When Germany sought to negotiate an armistice to bring about the end to the fighting, they wanted terms along the lines of those 14 points. By then, they had begun to experience food shortages, leading to discontent and disorder, both among troops and civilians. Battlefield casualties and the impact of an influenza epidemic, called the Spanish flu because Spain didn't have any restrictions on news since they were officially a neutral nation. But this was also causing manpower problems for the German military. The basic terms of the agreement were to cease all hostilities and evacuate occupied areas, surrender military materials, including artillery, aircraft, plus the warships and the submarines. In January of 1919, the Paris Peace Conference opened with delegates from over 30 countries participating, although it would be dominated by the leaders of the Big Four: the French Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, the U.S. President, and the Italian Prime Minister. Their decisions would be ratified by the other participants. 5 major peace treaties resulted, with the Treaty of Versailles signed first. It was essentially the peace treaty that dealt with Germany. Some of the others dealt with Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Key aspects of this treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, were the requirement for Germany to disarm itself, to give up substantial territory, and to pay reparations to some of the other countries, initially assessed at over $31 billion, which would be roughly equivalent to around $440 billion today. Perhaps the most controversial provision of the treaty was what was called the War Guilt Clause, placing the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all of the loss and damage imposed on the Allied nations. Some aspects of the 14 points had to be bartered away or modified heavily in order to get the treaties passed at all. For example, the idea of national self-determination, meaning breaking up of empires into the constituent parts, only applied to the losing side. The colonies of the victors were ignored. The treaty's terms against Germany resulted in economic collapse and bitter resentment, which powered the rise of the Nazi Party and eventually the outbreak of the Second World War. The part of the Treaty of Versailles that caused the most debate and controversy in the United States was the provision to create an international League of Nations. When Wilson had traveled to Paris for the negotiations, he had failed to bring a single Republican senator with him, and it's the Senate, controlled by the Republican Party at the time, that would have to ratify the treaty. This created a battle over its ratification. Many senators were concerned that membership in the League would threaten U.S. sovereignty, fearing that the League's plans for collective security could potentially pull the U.S. into future wars. But according to the U.S. Constitution, only Congress had the power to declare war. Others wanted to return to the tradition of U.S. isolationism, believing that the U.S. should focus on its own interests and not those of Europe. Reservationists, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, suggested modifications to protect American interests. But Wilson was uncompromising. Public opinion in the U.S. was divided, so to try and sway the public to his ideals, Wilson went on a major tour of cities, giving speeches, encouraging the people to put pressure on their congressmen to accept the treaty as written. The tour was such an ordeal that he suffered a stroke, which incapacitated him. In the end, the U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and all the other treaties negotiated at the Paris Peace Conference, and with it, the League of Nations, leaving it to pursue a policy of isolationism during the interwar period. The profound implications for the course of international relations and for the League's ability to effectively prevent future conflicts. Well, that covers what you need to know about World War I, the military and diplomacy, for topic 7.5. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.